الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh al-Maram من أدلة الأحكام by Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and today inshallah ta'ala, seeing that we have ended in the last session the discussion that he had mentioned, or a hadith that he had mentioned relating to the topic of ahkam al-janaba wa junub. So matters relating to ahkam al-junub, regarding the person in a state of sexual impurity, and matters that relates to this. So we have ended that discussion, and today inshallah ta'ala in this session we'll be discussing a new topic that he mentioned here, bab tayammum. So kitab or bab tayammum would be the discussion. So we'll mention the first hadith that is mentioned here and have the discussion relating to this particular hadith. Bi'awnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Chapter 9, At-Tayammum. Narrated Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhuma. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, I have been given 5 things which were not given to anyone else before me. Allah made me victorious by awe for a distance of 1 month's journey. The earth has been made for me a place of praying and a means of purification. Therefore, any one of my followers must pray whenever the time of salah is due. In the hadith of Hudhayfa, Muslim has, the soil of the earth has been made for us as a means of purification, when we do not find water. Ahmad has, on the authority of Ali radiallahu an, the soil has been made for me a means of purification.
So these are the hadith that Author rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned regarding this discussion regarding bab tayammum. So he mentioned 3 hadith. That the first of those hadith, he mentioned the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah رضي الله عنهما أن النبي عليه السلام قال أعطيت 5, that I was giving 5 matters لم يعطيهن أحد قبلي, that none were given this before me. نصرت بالرعب مسيرة الشهر, that I was giving the fear in the art of the kuffar for a month's journey. وجعلت لي الأرض masjidan wa tuhura, and also I was given the earth as a place, as a masjid, and also a place for purification. فأيما رجل, that any man أدركه الصلاة, that anyone that salat meet them, then he mentioned فليصل, then the person should pray. Then he mentioned فذكر الحديث, then he mentioned the hadith. Then after also he mentioned after this hadith of Hudhayfa ibn Hudhayfa رضي الله عنه عند مسلم قال جهلت تربتها لنا طهورا إذا لم يجد ماء, or إذا لم نجد ماء, if we did not find water. So the earth had been made pure if we did not find water. Then he mentioned hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib in the Ahmed, this narration that Ahmed called جهلت التراب لي طهورا, that I was granted the turab, the earth, for me as a purification. So these are the hadith that he mentioned or started with regarding discussion regarding some of the ahkam that relates to tayammum. So as for the system that we'll follow, that we'll try to mention regarding the hadith, each hadith further regarding takhrij, and Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentioned some of the hadith somewhat mukhtasaran, and some of the hadith he did not mention its source. So we'll go through the hadith by way of takhrij. These hadith that have been mentioned, we start the hadith of Jabir, and then the others will follow. Then also we discuss concerning the alfaz that I mentioned in the hadith, which the hadith that is just a summary of the hadith or a portion of the hadith. So we mention those hadith and the wording of those hadith, also the meaning of the hadith as to what these hadith are discussing, and also we discuss concerning the matter regarding tayammum, regarding muqaddimah of what is tayammum, what is meant by tayammum, lugatan, istilahan, and the likes. So regarding concerning first regarding takhrij of the hadith that he have mentioned, as for the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma, where he mentioned that فذكر الحديث. So when he mentioned hadith, he mentioned وذكر الحديث, he mentioned the hadith. So they mentioned that Ibn Hajar that did not mention regarding the source of this hadith. So he did not mention the source of this particular hadith. So they mentioned the hadith that according to Sheikh Al-Fal in his checking of the book Bulugh Al-Maram, he mentioned this hadith, which is number 3. He mentioned the hadith akhrajahu Abd ibn Humayd. So Abd ibn Humayd, that he has a book in hadith that is in print. وأحلت, Darimi also mentioned this hadith. Bukhari, ومسلم, Nasa'i, Ibn Hibban, والبيهقي. So these are the sources that have been mentioned by Sheikh Al-Fal, where they mentioned the hadith in the Abd ibn Humayd, Ahmed, Ad-Darimi, Bukhari, and Muslim, Nasa'i, Ibn Hibban, and Bayhaqi. So these are some of the sources that have been mentioned regarding the first hadith of Jabir. As for what has been mentioned by others regarding concerning this particular hadith of Jabir, that it mentioned regarding this hadith, that it is mentioned in the Bukhari, ومسلم, متفق عليه, and the wording of this hadith as mentioned by Abdullah Fawzan, the wording of the hadith, that it is taken from Bukhari. This word, the wording of the hadith, it is taken from Bukhari. And also the hadith in Ahmed, Nasa'i, Ibn Abi Shayba, Ibn Hibban, Bayhaqi, Al-Baghawi in his book Sharh As-Sunnah, Darimi in his Jami' or Sunan, wa Abu Na'im in his book Al-Hilya. So the hadith have been mentioned by these sources and others as stated here. So and others who have mentioned regarding Shaykh Al-Nas when he mentioned this particular hadith, or others when they mentioned this particular hadith, that Shaykh Al-Nas, that when he mentioned the hadith here, that he stated regarding concern the first hadith of Jabir in the Bukhari, Muslim, Ahmed, Nasa'i, Bayhaqi. So these are sort of the mention of this hadith. So as we said, that's the first hadith. So as for this first hadith of Jabir, and the source that we have mentioned, that as for the full wording of the hadith, that was not mentioned, but rather the author only mentioned a section or a portion of the hadith, not mentioned the full hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in this hadith that he mentioned أعطيت خمسا لم يعطيهن أحد قبلي, that I was giving 5 matters that none was giving before me. So what he mentioned, that I was granted 5 things particular to me by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the Anbiya, the prophets that came before, were not given. So these things are particular to the Prophet ﷺ, and as we mentioned, that they are said to be khasa'is. So these things that are particular to the Prophet ﷺ, that were not shared with him with other Anbiya. Then the Prophet ﷺ then start to list off those things that he was granted from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that these things were not given to other prophets that came before. He mentioned Nusirtu al-Rub, Masiratu Shahr, that he mentioned regarding of those things, that mentioned that fear was placed, I was giving like victory over the disbeliever, where fear was placed in their hearts for over a month. So that's one regarding a jihad. Then he mentioned a certain وَجُئِلَتْ لِي أَرْض مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا, and he mentioned the second of these 5 things, that for me, the Prophet ﷺ, that the earth was granted to me as a place, as a masjid, a place to perform salah, and also tahuran, and also a place for purification. So the earth was for the Prophet ﷺ and for his ummah, that they were allowed to use the earth as a place to pray on it, and also to use of the earth regarding as a form of purification, a preparation for acts of ibadah. Then I mentioned, so those are the ones that I mentioned, that he continue to mention as what is meant, فَأَيُّمَا رَجُلٍ مِنْ أُمَّتِي أَدْرَكَتْهُ الصَّلَاةِ, that anyone from my ummah. So also we mentioned that, in some of the narration of the books, that this section regarding that ummati is not mentioned. So in the checking of Sheikh Fal, when he mentioned the hadith, mentioned أَيُّمَا رَجُلٍ أَدْرَكَتْهُ, did I mention ummati? As in this other narration I mentioned أَيُّمَا رَجُلٍ. So the hadith, it mentioned that in Bukhari, the hadith of Jabir, that it mentioned regarding concerning that min ummati, the hadith of Jabir, min ummati, that it mentioned that adrakatu as-salat, that a person have met with him as-salat, that it mentioned fasalli, then he should pray. So it mentioned that the hadith of Jabir, it mentioned in Bukhari, ayyuma rajulin min ummati, that any person from my ummah, they mention male or female, min ummati, min ummati Muhammad alayhi wasalam, ummatil Muhammad alayhi salam, yani ummatul al-ijaba, adrakathu as-salat, that anyone that salat have met him, fasalli, then he should pray. Then it mentioned the other things. So the author here, Ibn Hajar, that he mentioned of the portion of this hadith, the section that he needed as a form of dalil for the point that he wished that he is discussing. So I mentioned the point for him as the point of discussion, or the point as evidence, where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned hadith, ju'ilat li ard masjidan wa tahura, where the earth was granted to me as a place to pray, and also a place for purification. Then it mentioned that based upon this, فَأَيُّمَا رَجُلْ مِنْ أُمَّتِي, that any person from my ummah, أَدْرَكَتْهُ الصَّلَاةِ, that salat have come upon him, فَلْيُصَلِّ, then he should pray. Then it mentioned the other things. أُحِلَّتْ لِي مغانم, that also for me, that the maghanim was made halal, which is the spoils of war as you refer to. وَلَمْ تُحِلْ لِأَحد قبلي, and this was not given to those of the anbiya that came before me. وأعطيت شفاعة, أعطيت الشفاعة, and also I was granted الشفاعة. وكان النبي, and also so I was granted الشفاعة, intercession that occurs in the next life, intercession that will occur on يوم عند الموقف. وكان النبي عليه السلام تبعث, and also prophets, that the prophet was تبعث إلى قومه, that the prophets that they were sent to their nation, إلى قومه خاصة, to their specific nations. Then he mentioned وبعثت إلى الناس عامة, but I was sent to the general mass, I was sent to the general people. So that's concerning the hadith. And as we mentioned, that this hadith it mentioned gives some more detail as to what are these 5 things. So that's the hadith of Jabir in the Bukhari, Muslim, Ahmed, Nasahi, Bayhaqi, Ibn Hibban, and others, that clarify regarding the Prophet ﷺ was granted of these things. So that's concerning takhrij of the hadith. And we mentioned Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala that he mentioned وذكر الحديث. He didn't per se mention the sources of this hadith. He didn't mention the source of this hadith, as would be his normal practice. So that hadith is narrated in Bukhari, the wording of Al-Bukhari. As for this first hadith that we'll discuss and discuss the others, that he mentioned that أُعطِيتُ خَمْسًا, that the Prophet ﷺ, that he was granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 5 things. And these 5 that I mentioned, that these things are 5 khisal, that he was granted 5 matters, and the one who granted him these matters is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have granted the Prophet ﷺ 5 matters as in this hadith. The ulama discussion regarding that these 5 matters, is it specific? The thing that the Prophet ﷺ was granted, is it restricted to 5 things or more? And as we'll discuss, that it exceed these 5 things. So the Prophet ﷺ was granted, it exceed these 5 things. So even though a number was mentioned, that it is mentioned regarding 5 things that he have stated in this hadith. But then you have other hadith, and many other hadith that discuss other things. And we'll discuss concerning these things that are referred to as khasa'is and Nabi alayhi salam, those things which is specific to the Prophet alayhi salam. So that's concerning this hadith. So the shahid from the hadith is where I mentioned that جُعِلَتْ لِي الْأَرْض مَسْجِدًا وَطُهُورًا, that for me the earth was made as something for salah and tahur and purification. They mentioned regarding concern this matter regarding the Prophet ﷺ, that of those things that he was granted in this hadith, of these 5 things that were not given to other anbiya. So showing that the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have blessed the Prophet ﷺ and granted the Prophet ﷺ as a form of honoring the Prophet ﷺ things that other prophets were not given. So you might find things that regarding, as I mentioned, khasa'is, things that are particular to the anbiya or rusul. So you find certain things that are specific to the Prophet and the anbiya and not to their nations. then there's things that the Prophet ﷺ, our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was granted and not granted to other Anbiya, nor their nations. So things that are only specific to him and not given to the Anbiya and their nation before. And also things that are specific to him and his nation, not granted to nations before. So as we'll discuss further regarding these khasa'is and nabuwah. So after that, regarding concerning that in times of the enemy, facing the enemy, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have granted him like victory and put fear in the hearts of the disbelievers. And I mentioned that the disbeliever, for that time span that is given for over a month. So the time span that fear is placed in their hearts. And that applies to him and to his nation. Then it mentioned regarding concern that there was the shahid, ju'ilat li ard masjidan wa tahura. That it mentioned regarding that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted for the Prophet ﷺ and his nation that the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have granted the earth regarding that as a place for salah. Makan sujood. So it mentioned here masjid, in the sense of they mentioned concerning masjid, that doesn't mean the physical building, by the physical building of the masjid, but the building, and also this extend to also the earth in general. So the salat, the Muslim, that they are allowed to pray and use as a sujood, a place of prayer, the masjid itself, the building, this physical building, and also things outside the masjid, and also any place outside the masjid, with the exception of those places that texts have proven that's not allowed to pray in those areas. So as we'll discuss those also later. So this hadith is generalized regarding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have granted the Prophet ﷺ, this ummah, the permission for them to pray wherever, whether inside a building or outside a building, where contrary the nations before. So contrary to the nations before, that regarding their salah, praying, that they were only restricted to pray in their kanais. They were only restricted to pray in their kanisa, in their places of worship, their churches and their synagogues and their places of worship. So the nation before were not allowed to pray outdoors. They were only restricted to pray within the building, that the structure that they consider to be their place of worship. As for us, that's been restricted, or that has been lifted from us. Then also tahuran, then also the Prophet mentioned regarding concerning tahuran, by way of a form of something to use for purification. So the earth can be used as a purification in preparing the person to carry out certain acts of worship, such as salah and the likes. So the person is allowed to use the earth as a form of purification, and that is that to be also to be discussed further. Then also the Prophet ﷺ can somewhat and give some clarification regarding أيما رجل من أمتي, that if a person from my ummah, that means can I mention that a rajul, it doesn't mean it is specific to men, but man here, or man, also includes female. So male and female, man and woman. So anyone from this ummah, whether male or female, that wishes to pray, then they can pray, and salat is upon them, then they can pray whether they're inside a building or outside a building. So they mentioned that a person should not wait regarding his salat, that he should not delay his salat. Also, that the person or wait for water. If he cannot find water, then he's allowed to make tayammum. As the word tahur, meaning concerning tayammum, includes tayammum. So for the person to pray by making tayammum if he's unable to find water. Then also other things the Prophet ﷺ was granted, as he mentioned, regarding concerning other things, that he was given concerning ghanaim, dispose of war booty, as referred to concerning, as I mentioned, ma ukhida min amwal kuffar fil jihad. That is the wealth that is taken from the kuffar after jihad, fi sabilillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for nations before, they were not allowed to take ghanaim, war booty. The nation before were not allowed to seize or to take the war booty of their of their enemies. والشفاعة الشفاعة العظمى regarding concerning the matter regarding the Prophet ﷺ interceding on behalf of others and Yawm al-Qiyamah. So that is a shafa', and that's matter regarding aqadiyah, regarding so matters regarding Islamic belief, regarding the Prophet ﷺ will intercede on the behalf of others Yawm al-Qiyamah. With conditions, as this is explained further in the books of Aqaid. In the books of Aqaid, it is discussed further. So that's concerning this particular hadith of the hadith of Jabir. So as we mentioned that of the discussion, that this hadith mentioned these 5 things. The author mentioned a few as he wanted to just mention the portion that he need for what is being discussed. The point that is needed for this discussion. So as for of the other matters, we'll discuss the other hadith in the next session. As for of those matters that are mentioned in the hadith, the next matter, that matter related to, after discussing the hadith, that also the hadith mentioned our khasa'is, that will cover more so matters also regarding that this particular hadith, that it mentioned regarding that different ways of tahara. So regarding concerning what Islam have allowed, regarding purification, that as mentioned before, that a person need to purify himself regarding matters of certain acts of ibadah, worship that needs to be carried out, requires tahara. That if the person will carry out al-wudu, and we cover concerning ahkam al-wudu, so it's a partial, a specific way of purification of washing certain limbs on the body, and that been covered before. Then also the second is a person doing a full wash of the body. So with wudu, it's a partial wash of the body. With al-ghusl, it's another form of tahara, but it's a full wash of the body. So these are forms of tahara using ma, but these include the person using water, and that's the asl. Then if the person is unable, does not have access to water, or unable to make use of that water, then the person also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give the person said that the person have a substitute or a backup, and that substitute is tayammum. So tayammum, that Islam have given the worshipper of another form of purification, which is using tayammum, as we'll cover. So tayammum is the backup or the replacement for whenever the person is unable to have access to water, to make either a full purification of ghusl or a partial by way of wudu. So this so the author before I mentioned previously, so the author before I mentioned ahkam al-ghusl, and before then he discussed ahkam al-wudu. So the person understand that these are the how to purify oneself, use of water. But if they are not allowed, if they are not available, what to be done? Then the person go to tayammum, and that's from the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this nation. That we have been given this matter, and as we'll discuss, that tayammum is of the khasa'is of this ummah. Is of the khasa'is of this, the thing that is only specific to this nation, while nation before were not allowed. So regarding concern the hadith, that they mentioned the hadith regarding tayammum, that they have reached a level of hadith mutawatir. So hadith, you have various hadith I've discussed regarding tayammum, so that hadith are mutawatir. So that shows that that's a hadith mutawatir regarding tayammum. Also, they discuss regarding there's evidence from the Quran regarding concerning the proof of tayammum by way of Quran wa sunnah wal ijma. So the proof of tayammum can be found in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of Quran wa sunnah wal ijma. And this hadith and this discussion indicate that it is something which is allowed, showing the permissibility of the act of tayammum. Also, regarding concerning the ulama discuss what is tayammum. So what is said to be tayammum? You have different aqwal that are mentioned regarding a tayammum. Of those who mention that a tayammum lugatan first, tayammum lugatan. What is meant by this? They mention that the meaning concerning al-qasd. Tayammum linguistically the meaning is al-qasd, having that intent or aim. Or then the second meaning that is also mentioned, and that's for us the important that of importance to us, is shar'an. What's the meaning of tayammum? Shar'an. So in the Islamic law, what is meant by tayammum, or what is defined as tayammum? You have various definitions that are given, that of those who mention that tayammum, it is mas wajh wal yadayn بالتراب tahur ala wajh makhsus. So of those who have kind of somewhat given a meaning at to wipe the face and the hands with pure dirt in a specific manner. So they mention mas al wajh wal yadayn بالتراب tahur ala wajh makhsus. Others who have mentioned that what is said to be tayammum, they mentioned qasd ila sa'id بمس الوجه واليدين. So they mentioned that qasd ila sa'id, that a person that go towards, or the intent of using of sa'id, things upon the earth, to wipe his face and hands, biniyatin istibaha as-salat wa nahu, that it with intention to allow the person to pray salat and things similar. That's another definition that is given. That others, Ibn Mulakin, he mentioned qasd isal at-turab ila wajh wal yadayn bishara'it maqsusa. So Ibn Mulakin, he mentioned that our definition, I mentioned qasd isal, so the person intend to place turab, dirt, upon his face, or wipe over his face and his hands with specific conditions. Bassam, Sheikh Bassam, Abdullah Bassam, in his explanation of Bulugh Maram, he mentioned that what is said to be tayammum shar'an masal wajh wal yadayn, wiping of the face and the hands, both hands, bisa'idin, with something of the earth, ala wajh al-makhsus, in a specific manner, in a specific way. So that's the definition that he have given. Then we'll find that Ibn Uthaymeen, Ali rahmatullahi ta'ala, wa al-Baqun, that they mention that what is said to be, what Ibn Uthaymeen mentioned as what is tayammum. قال هو تعبد لله, that is for a person to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بمس الوجه واليدين, by wiping the face and both his hands, على صفة مخصوص, in a specific way. So wiping, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by wiping the face and the hands, both hands, in a specific manner. So those are the definition that is given regarding tayammum. So of those definition that is given regarding tayammum, Sheikh Abdullah Bassam, he mentioned shar'an mas al-wajh wal yadayn, wiping the face and the hands, min sa'id at-tayyib, from pure earth, badalan an taharat al-ma, which is a replacement of the use of water in the ta'adhur isti'malu, if the person is unable to make use of water. So that's concerning the definition that are given regarding tayammum. So Ibn Uthaymeen, when he mentions, when his definition, huwa ta'abbud lillah, that part is important. Ta'abbud lillah is an act of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bimas al-wajh wal yadayn, also all include that as a part of their definition of wiping the face and the hands. Then they mention ala sifatin makhsus, in a specific in a specific way. Most also mention that as a criteria of the definition. Then also that if anything to be added regarding of Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala, definition mention that what is mentioned regarding that ta'abbud lillah bimas al-wajh wal-yadayn min sa'id tayyib, min sa'id tayyib, So if Ibn Uthaymeen have included concerning min Sa'id at-Tayyib, then also that would be that also to be noted that I mentioned ala sifatin makhsus, then also in a specific way for it to be carried out. So that's concerning the general overall definition that have been given by the ulama regarding what is said to be tayammum. Different in wordings, but the general meaning of majority of the ulama are somewhat very similar. So for a person, ta'abbudillah, in a way of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and some mention a niyyah, having of the niyyah. So the person which is ta'abbud with the intention of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by wiping the face and the hands upon Sa'id Tayyib, upon the earth's surface, bisifatin makhsus, in a specific way as outlined in the Sharia, and that will be all of these to be covered. So that's concerning what is said to be tayammum. What is said to be tayammum. Of the ulama, they have discussed a matter as mentioned by others and Ibn Mulaqin amongst those who, and also who have discussed the matter, and also As-San'ani, that they discussed the matter regarding with this matter regarding tayammum. So they mentioned that hukum at-tayammum, so said that it is something which is, that they discuss at-tayammum, it is something which is mubah, to be done, with its conditions. So tayammum, it is that which is mubah, mashru', it is legislated for a person to carry out tayammum, and we mentioned that it can be found in the Quran, wa sunnah wal ijma, by way of evidence. Then I mentioned that a discussion between the ulama, where they discuss concerning tayammum, is it said to be a rukhsa, something which is said to be a rukhsa, or azima. So azima, as they mentioned concerning that azima, that as they state, hukman thabit بالدليل شرعي خال عن معارض الراجح. So al-azima, that ulama mentioned that concerning that in usul al-fiqh, that when they discuss concerning that ahkam al-shar'iyya, so the ulama in usul al-fiqh, when they discuss concerning ahkam al-shar'iyya, that they place ahkam al-shar'iyya into two categories. Ahkam al-shar'iyya, so ahkam al-shar'iyya التكليفية, أحكام الشرعية التكليفية, that includes those 5 things which is wajib, mandub or mustahab, mubah, makruh, and haram. So أحكام الشرعية التكليفية, that they mention that it revolves around those 5 wajib or / fard, mandub, also / mustahab / fadila, muraggab fi, all of those are within mandub. 3rd, mubah, something is permissible. The 4th, makruh, something is disliked. And the 5th that they mention, al-haram, that's something which is forbidden. So these are ahkam al-shar'iyya taklifiyya al-khamsa. Then a second group they mention ahkam al-shar'iyya wad'iyya. Ahkam al-shar'iyya wad'iyya. So this comes to that these are things that have been placed as a alama. So you have things that have been placed. These are things that are placed. Ahkam that as a they mention. And of those ones that are mentioned in wad'iyya, they mention azima and also ar-ruqsa. Azima wa ruqsa. So they mention that azima, where they mention something azima, ta'akkad, that something is established. That's the norm. So like I said, azima would be that the normal established practice, that the person who's at home, he prays residential, he prays dhuhr arba rakah. But a person who's a traveler, then it's a ruqsa, is allowed to pray rakatain, to shorten his salat. So with tayammum, they mention the asl, it is ma, it is water, that's the main source. But if not available, the person can use the earth, make tayammum. So wudu, ghusl is the asl, the use of water. But if water is not available or do not have access to water, then the person can go to something else, which is tayammum, which is the person striking the earth. So they mentioned that some of the ulama who mention it is, so in general concern, that Abu Hamid of the ulama who mention it is azima. It is azima, that it's on its own. It's not that it's a firm established ruling. Others who mention it's a rukhsa. Other of the ulama mention it's a form of rukhsa. It's like a concession that has been given. It's a concession where and so they mention that it is a rukhsa. And Al-Ghazali in his book Al-Mustasfa, that he mentioned regarding concerning that inna tayammum li'adam al-ma azima, that he mentioned that tayammum with the absence of water it is azima, it stands as its own ruling. That he mentioned wa inna tayammum, and that tayammum fi wujudihi, yani ma'al wujudi, with the presence of water, lamani' ma'al wujudi, yani with the presence of water, lima'nihin, for certain reasons, some barriers, kamarad, such as a person who is ill, wanahwi, or cases of these, they mention ruqsa. Wa hasan, that this explanation is hasan. So they mention that they see that it serves at times as azima, with the absence of water, it becomes now the main source of tahara. But if water is present, but due to reason, a person unable to make use of the water, have access to the water, that the person could be ill, but water is present, but because of the illness, he cannot make use of the water, so he make tayammum. Or the person has been told by the doctor not to use water because of certain injuries or certain illness, then water is present, but due to ma'na, some form of barrier, then the person make tayammum. So they mention in that case it becomes ruqsa because water is present. But because of a ma'na, a reason, is unable. So that's concerning what they mentioned regarding that particular matter. So that inshallah ta'ala will end this discussion for today regarding some of the points relating to at-tayammum. And inshallah ta'ala we'll continue in the other coming sessions regarding ahkam tayammum. So today we more discuss concerning hadith of Jabir. Then also we discuss concerning different wording of the hadith of Jabir. Also to clarify that Ibn Hajar that did not mention the source of the hadith regarding where the source of the hadith came from. But the hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim and others, this wording of Asai Bukhari, he mentioned a portion of the hadith, not all the entire hadith, that discuss certain things that are particular to the Prophet ﷺ. Then also we discuss concerning what is tayammum, lugatan, linguistically, and also tayammum, also shar'an, with different aqwal of the ulama. And also we discuss concerning that is a form of tahara, and tahara of different types, anwa tahara, wudu, ghusl, with tayammum. And tayammum, what we discuss in fall in one of those categories that have been given to us by the Sharia. And also we discuss concerning that with tayammum, is it ruqsa or azima? For that inshallah ta'ala we'll end today and continue in next session. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخرة والحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك استغفرك واتوب